Christians embraced the message of a compassionate God who hears the cry of the alien, the immigrant, the widows and their children, the poor and the hopeless, like those we hear about in our first reading from Exodus. They heeded the word of Jesus in today's gospel. Love God with all your heart, all your soul, all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. Because they took God's word and brought it to life in their thoughts, words, and deeds, those early believers were indeed a new breed of people. They truly had something of the divine in them. Today, God's word is presented in the sacred texts, challenges the quality of our own commitment to Christ. If an early Christian were among us today, how might they describe the worldwide Christian community? Is there something divine in the way we gather around the Word and the Eucharist to be fed? I would definitely say yes. But is there anything divine in the fact that people all over our world are dying of hunger and disease caused by malnutrition every second of the day? Surely there is something divine in the generosity we show to people at Thanksgiving and Christmas. But is there anything Christ-like about only part-time, seasonal commitment? Let me say that we are very blessed here at the Co-Cathedral of the Sacred Heart. We have a parish social ministry outreach that helps hundreds of people and remained active even during the challenging time of COVID-19. We have committed volunteers who have gone beyond seasonal commitment and have made this a regular part of their way of life. They have embraced discipleship in a big way and are beautiful examples and models of what we should all be doing. We should see a reflection of the divine in the human community with its beautifully diverse complexions, cultures, traditions, and ethnicities. But there is nothing remotely divine in some of the things that happen every day in this wonderful country of ours. There is no hint of holiness in the prejudice, selfishness, and ignorance that persist in the hearts and minds of some that profess to be totally given over to the love of God, yet find no place in their hearts for those who have different opinions, political convictions, or ideas. There is nothing holy or divine in destroying the property of others in the name of peaceful protesting. There is nothing holy in targeting people for harm simply because they wear the uniform of a law enforcement officer or because they are of a different race, religion, or ethnic background. Love for God and love for neighbor. We have heard these words from Jesus multiple times. Even though the question from the Pharisee in today's gospel was intended to trigger an argument and trap Jesus, it was a real question back then. In Judaism at that time, there was a debate about one law around which the rest revolve. Jesus was not the first to cite the love of God and the love of one's neighbor as the two greatest commandments. Jesus answered their question by quoting a section from the book of Deuteronomy, familiar to everyone there. The Shema, which was and is the closest thing that the Jewish people have to a profession of faith, states, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God. The Lord is love. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and your might." The faithful Jew says these words in the morning and at nightfall every day of his life. It is the first Hebrew sentence a child learns, and it is the utterance of which every Jew is supposed to breathe his last breath. When Jesus answered, the questioners realized that a chance for a debate had suddenly evaporated, and they started to leave. But then Jesus says, "There's a second," and everyone stops. He then quotes from the book of Leviticus, "Love your neighbor as yourself." The surprise was not the references. They all knew them from Deuteronomy and Leviticus. The surprise was Jesus putting them together almost on an equal level of importance. Here, Jesus is describing the two legs of a healthy Christian life. Some people try to get by with one leg. They love God, but not their neighbor. They want a private spirituality independent of the world. But Jesus calls us to be part of a community of faith, a church, to extend his compassion to others and to be instruments of his peace. A private spirituality is foreign to the gospel, which says, "You are the salt of the earth, you are the light of the world, you are leaven. What you did to the least of these, you did for me." There are others who do the opposite. They might love their neighbor, but have no relationship with God. They might be called compassionate humanists. Sometimes we hear people say, "I'm a good person, I don't steal, I don't hurt anyone, I try to help my neighbor." But as Christians, we are called to a living relationship with Jesus Christ. We are called to experience communion of life with the Trinity, a supernatural level of being. Each of these two legs has a life of its own. At first, we may have identified our love for God with emotions of devotion, easy inspirations, and then one day they disappear. They may be harder to come by as we go through what has been called a dark night of the soul. Later, we see this as a grace that enables our love of God to mature. If we stay faithful to the dark night, as St. Mother Teresa of Calcutta did, our love of God becomes less dependent on our emotions, less demanding of God, and more peaceful, more trusting. We learn surrender, which is always a sign of spiritual maturity, rather than trying to manipulate God as children try to do with their parents. The same thing happens with love for our neighbor. At first, our notion of love for others is very sentimental and maybe even a little bit romanticized. Then we encounter ingratitude, manipulation, indifference, hostility, and deception from those we have tried to help. We experience what I call the dark night of Christian charity. Again, if we stay faithful, our love of neighbor matures. We come to see that Christian charity may require candor and honesty, enabling people to become more than they are. Love of God and love of neighbor are the two legs of our Christian life, and we need them both. Our love for God is shown in a relationship of worship and prayer. In the Catholic Church, we have a very concrete criteria of how we show our love for God in our prayer and worship as a church. Faithfulness to our Sunday obligation and daily prayer are the thermometers of our love for God, and they prevent us from deceiving ourselves when someone might claim to love God and yet never pray. If our spiritual life is weak, maybe one of these two legs is being neglected. If our prayer life seems flat, then maybe we need to look at extending ourselves more generously to others. If our working with others is unfocused or draining, then maybe we need to strengthen our prayer life. Through both, our discipleship of Jesus becomes whole and entire. Through both love of God and neighbor, we receive grace and mission. The love of God gives us grace. The love of neighbor gives us mission. To return to my beginning theme in closing, something of the divine is reflected in the faith, hope, and love that bind us one to another and together to God. We, for our part, are to keep that spark of the divine glowing within us through our prayer together and in our consistent efforts to translate our love for God into love for one another. We are never alone or unaided in our efforts. God's grace is ever present, just waiting to be accepted, so that something divine might always shine forth in us.